January 17, 1944. 29,000 feet above the frozen heart of Germany, the air is so cold it has weight. It presses against aluminum skin, seeps through riveted seams, and finds the flesh beneath leather and wool. Inside the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, Second Lieutenant James R. Harwell can no longer feel his fingers. He has been airborne for 93 minutes, and for the last 40, he has been trying to remember what warmth feels like. His breath freezes before it leaves his oxygen mask. The moisture in his eyes crystallizes at the edges. Below him, somewhere through the cloud layer, is Bremen, a city he is supposed to protect bombers over, a city whose flak batteries are waiting to shred him from the sky. But the enemy he is fighting now is not German. It is physics. It is the simple, murderous fact that at this altitude, in this season, the outside air temperature is 67 degrees below zero, and his fighter, designed to kill, has become a flying coffin of ice. He is not alone in this. Across the winter sky of 1944, hundreds of American fighter pilots are discovering the same brutal truth, that the United States Army Air Forces, in its desperation to extend the range and reach of its escort fighters, has inadvertently engineered a new kind of hell. They called it the extension of the air war. They called it deep penetration missions. They called it progress. But the pilots, those who survived, called it something else. They called it freezing to death at combat speed. This is not how it was supposed to go. When the 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe in 1942, the promise was simple: American industrial might, precision bombing, and the sheer audacity of flying in daylight would bring Germany to its knees. The flying fortresses would sail through enemy skies in tight formations, their overlapping fields of fire turning back any Luftwaffe attack. Fighter escort was considered unnecessary, a luxury even. The bombers, it was believed, could defend themselves. They were wrong. By the autumn of 1943, the losses were unsustainable. Entire bomber groups were being mauled over targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, would wait until the short-range Allied escorts turned back, then descend on the bomber streams like wolves on wounded caribou. The Americans needed fighters that could go the distance. They needed planes that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And so they modified, they extended, they added external fuel tanks to P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, hung bombs and extra ammunition, pushed the operational ceiling higher and the mission duration longer. But in their haste to match the Luftwaffe's reach, they forgot to match the cold. German pilots knew the cold. They had learned it over the Eastern Front, where winter warfare was measured not just in ammunition, but in frostbite and engine failures. Luftwaffe cockpits were equipped with rudimentary heating systems. Hot air bled from the engine, funneled through ducting, circulated around the pilot's feet and hands. It was not comfort, it was survival. The Germans understood that a pilot who could not feel his controls was a pilot already dead. The Americans, in their confidence, had designed their fighters differently. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a beast of a machine weighing 7 tons, was built around firepower and durability. 8 50 caliber machine guns. An engine that could take punishment and keep running. Armor plating that could stop a 20-minute cannon shell. But heat? Heat was an afterthought. The P-47's cockpit heating system was minimal, a small vent near the pilot's feet fed by engine heat that did almost nothing above 25,000 feet. The P-51 Mustang, sleeker and longer ranged, was even worse. Its glycol-cooled engine provided some warmth, but not enough, not nearly enough. And so the pilots climbed, mission after mission, through the winter of 1943 and into the killing cold of early 1944. They climbed to altitudes where the air itself became hostile. They wore everything they had Wool undergarments, leather flight suits, fleece-lined jackets, gloves layered 3 deep. Some wrapped their feet in newspaper, others rubbed their hands with Vaseline before pulling on their gloves, hoping the grease would insulate. It was never enough. Lieutenant Harwell, on that January morning, had done all of this. He had dressed like a man preparing for an Arctic expedition. He had checked his oxygen supply twice. He had flexed his fingers inside his gloves during the taxi and takeoff, keeping the blood moving. And for the first hour, it had worked. But now, deep into enemy airspace, his body was losing the fight. The cold was methodical. It began with the extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears. The blood retreated inward, prioritizing the core, abandoning the periphery. His feet, pressed against the rudder pedals, became numb blocks. His hands, gripping the stick, lost dexterity. He could still move them, but only in gross motions. Fine control, the kind needed to line up a shot or avoid a collision, was slipping away. His face, behind the oxygen mask, ached with a deep, bone-level pain. And the shivering had stopped. That was the worst sign. When the body stopped shivering, it meant it had given up trying to generate heat. It meant hypothermia was setting in. He was not the only one. Across the formation, other pilots were experiencing the same progression. Some flexed their hands compulsively, trying to keep circulation. Others stamped their feet against the cockpit floor, a futile gesture at 29,000 feet. A few, the unlucky ones, had already lost too much. Their hands locked on the controls, their vision tunneled. They flew on, but they were no longer fully present, just frozen men in frozen machines, following the bombers out of muscle memory and fading willpower. The mission logs from that winter tell the story in clinical language. Pilot experienced severe frostbite to hands and feet. Unable to operate gun switches due to cold. Emergency landing. Pilot unresponsive in cockpit. But behind each entry was a man who had learned at altitude that America's technological superiority had limits, that the same factories that churned out fighters by the thousands had not thought to install adequate heaters, that the planners who extended the range of these aircraft had calculated fuel and ammunition, but not body temperature. The contrast was bitter. German pilots, for all their fuel shortages and dwindling numbers, climbed into cockpits that kept them functional. They could fight at altitude without their hands freezing to the stick. They could stay alert without hypothermia clouding their judgment. Meanwhile, the Americans, arriving in ever greater numbers, with newer planes and better training, were being defeated not by enemy guns, but by their own equipment's indifference to human limits. There is a perverse irony in this. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial might, could produce fighters faster than Germany could shoot them down. But it could not or did not keep its pilots warm. The abundance that America represented, the endless flow of planes, fuel, ammunition, stopped at the cockpit door. Inside it was just a man and the cold. By February 1944, the problem could no longer be ignored. Pilots were returning from missions with blackened fingers and toes, the telltale signs of frostbite. Some lost parts of their hands, others could not fly again for weeks. The sortie rates, so carefully calculated to maintain pressure on the Luftwaffe, were being eroded not by combat losses, but by cold-related casualties. Medical officers began filing reports, squadron commanders demanded solutions, and slowly, reluctantly, the supply chain responded. Heated flight suits began to arrive, electrically warmed garments that plugged into the aircraft's power system. They were bulky, prone to malfunction, and sometimes caused electrical burns if the wiring shorted. But they worked. Pilots who wore them could feel their fingers again, could stay alert, could fight. But the suits came too late for many. The winter of 1943-44 had already claimed its toll not in dramatic shoot-downs or flaming crashes, but in the quiet, incremental damage of cold. Men who would carry the scars, literal and otherwise, for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Harwell survived his mission. He landed at his base in England with hands so numb he could not unbuckle his harness. Ground crew had to lift him from the cockpit. He spent 3 days in the infirmary, his fingers swollen and discolored, nerves screaming as circulation returned. He flew again, but he never forgot. In interviews years later, he would say that the cold frightened him more than the flak, more than the German fighters. "You could see a 109 coming," he said. "You could shoot back, but the cold just took you piece by piece and there was nothing you could do." This was the hidden cost of America's air war. The price paid not in dramatic battles, but in the slow attrition of men pushed beyond what their equipment could protect. The bombers still flew, the escorts still climbed. But every pilot who strapped into a P-47 or P-51 that winter knew the truth. They were fighting two enemies, and only one of them wore a swastika. The cold became a symbol, though it was rarely spoken of that way. It represented the gap between American ambition and American care. The factories could build 30 fighters a day, the training schools could graduate 100 pilots a month. But somewhere in the chain of command, in the rush to match the Luftwaffe's reach, the simple human need for warmth had been overlooked. It was a failure of imagination, or perhaps of empathy, a belief that machinery mattered more than the men inside it. German pilots, intercepting these American formations, sometimes noticed. They saw the P-47s weaving erratically, the P-51s making sluggish turns. Some assumed it was inexperience. Others, the veterans, recognized it for what it was. Pilots fighting their own aircraft. There was no glory in shooting down a man who could barely move his hands. But war does not allow for such scruples. The cold made the Americans vulnerable, and the Luftwaffe exploited it. By spring the tide had turned. The heated suits became standard issue. Insulated boots were distributed. Procedures were revised to limit time at extreme altitude. And the deeper penetration missions, now flown with better preparation, began to break the Luftwaffe's back. American fighters reached Berlin, then beyond. The bombers, once so vulnerable, now arrived over their targets with swarms of escorts. The cold remained, but it was no longer winning. Yet the lessons of that winter lingered. The pilots who had frozen at 29,000 feet carried those memories into every subsequent mission. They checked their heating systems obsessively. They briefed new arrivals on the cold, on how it would creep in, on how to recognize the signs before it was too late. And they understood, in a way that the planners perhaps never did, that survival in war depends not just on firepower and courage, but on the small, unglamorous details, on heat, on oxygen, on equipment that remembers the human inside. There is a photograph from that winter, taken at an airbase in East Anglia. It shows a line of P-47 Thunderbolts, snow dusting their wings, ground crew working in the pre-dawn dark. In the foreground, a pilot stands beside his aircraft, bundled in layers, breath visible in the frozen air. He is looking up at the cockpit, and his expression is unreadable. Perhaps he is calculating the hours ahead. Perhaps he is simply trying to remember what warmth feels like. This is the image that endures, not the dramatic dogfights or the burning cities, but the quiet moment before, when a man prepares to climb into a machine that might protect him from bullets but cannot protect him from the cold. It is a reminder that war is fought not just with strategy and steel, but with flesh and blood, and the stubborn insistence that the mission matters more than comfort. The Americans won their air war. They defeated the Luftwaffe, escorted the bombers, and helped bring the Third Reich to its knees. But they did it at a cost that the mission reports rarely captured. They did it with frozen hands and blackened feet, with pilots who learned to fight through pain that had nothing to do with the enemy. They did it because they had to believe, that the cause was worth the suffering. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the freedom they fought for, the world they helped to preserve, justified every frozen finger and every hypothermic moment at altitude. But justice does not erase the cold. It does not warm the pilots who climbed into those cockpits day after day, knowing what waited for them above 25,000 feet. They flew anyway, they fought anyway, and in doing so they proved that American abundance, for all its failures and oversights, was matched by something harder to quantify: the resilience of men who refused to quit, even when their own equipment seemed designed to kill them. The cold was real, the suffering was real, but so too was the determination that carried them through it. That perhaps is the larger truth, that freedom is not won cleanly or comfortably or with perfect preparation. It is won by ordinary men in extraordinary cold, doing what must be done because no one else will. And when the spring finally came, and the missions continued under warmer skies, those who had survived the winter carried with them a knowledge that no training could teach, that the hardest battles are sometimes fought not against the enemy, but against the elements, and that victory belongs to those who endure both.